on YouTube. On YouTube.
Magandang umaga po mga kaibigan. Sa ating po namang Wednesday Roundtable at Lido, we will have a very sensitive issue to discuss. Sinasabi po na may kasaysayang nagdudulot o bibigay ng kaukulang impormasyon. Magandang umaga po mga kaibigan. Sa ating po namang Wednesday Roundtable at Lido, we will have a very sensitive issue to discuss. Sinasabi po na may kasaysayang nagdudulot o bibigay ng kaukulang impormasyon. Magandang umaga po mga kaibigan. Sa ating po namang Wednesday Roundtable at Lido, we will have a very sensitive issue to discuss. Hold on. Sinasabi po na may kasaysayang nagdudulot o bibigay ng kaukulang impormasyon. Okay, take two. Pasensya na po. Alam po ninyo mga kaibigan, pag binabanggit yung Saba, may mga nagtataas ng kilay. Ito ba'y bahagi ng ating bansa? Ano ba ang kasaysayan? Ano ba ang security implications? Take two. Pasensya na po. Alam po ninyo mga kaibigan, pag Alright, thank you. Take three. As I was saying a while ago, pag binanggit yung Saba, may mga nagtataas ng kilay. Bahagi ba ito ng Republika ng Pilipinas o ito ba ay bahagi na ng Malaysia? So this is a very interesting topic. It involves patrimony, it involves security, and the like. We invited resource persons who are in the best position to tell us what's going on and what will happen in the next few years. We have with us Dr. Romel Banlawi, a political scientist and security analyst. Siya po yung director ng Center for Intelligence and National Security Studies. We're also joined by the Honorable Alberto Encomienda, a retired career foreign service officer and law of the sea expert. And he was an ambassador to Malaysia, to Singapore, and to Greece. We're expecting Mr. Abraham Ijirani, the Secretary General of the Sultanate of Sulu, to join us, and the Honorable Frank Lubrigo, Geopolitics and International Relations Observer and a retired RTC judge. So for a background there on the Saba issue, let's start with the Honorable Alberto Encomienda. Ano po ang inyo naalala tungkol dito sa Saba? Mr. Ambassador.
Okay, thank you, Melo. Good morning to everybody. Well, the question was, ano ang aking naalaala? Well, that's a good phrasing because I was part of the work in progress on Sabah before, but I joined the department, well, it was already in progress. So may mga alaala lang ako sa simula, no? Okay. From the beginning, it is clear that, well, we had a claim to Sabah. Our claim to Sabah is based on a cession of sovereignty from the Sultan of Sulu. Yan, maliwanag yan. Until dumating yung Federation of Malaysia. In which case, we had to, kung ang kalaban natin is not only Malaysia, but the United Kingdom, but let's not forget na mayroon ding interest dyan ang United States. So anong laban natin with the United Kingdom, the United States, Malaysia, anong laban natin? So what happened was we pursued always the rule of law and peaceful settlement approach with Malaysia. And there were a series of negotiations with Malaysia until it abruptly cut off. Now, I want to emphasize this because meron tayong maraming mga issues on sovereignty or sovereign rights that we were consistent in trying to work this out in a very orderly manner, diplomatically following the rule of law. Our end game nga in the negotiations with Malaysia before the cut-off was a proposition that we brought to the UN and also with Malaysia, and Malaysia tentatively agreed that we refer this to the International Court of Justice. Now, okay, that was a continuing process from President Macapagal Arroyo, from President Diosdado Macapagal to President Marcos. And then, if I may use the phrase, somebody dropped the ball, except that it was not accidental. I'm sorry to say, this is my view, but having been exposed to it and looking at the process going on, it cut off also from our side. Okay, early in the administration of President.
Yes, Mr. Ambassador.
Sorry.
Yes, Mr. Ambassador, medyo bumagal yung internet kanina. You were saying during the time of Tita Cory, what happened?
Yeah. That was in the early part. There was actually one of the, shall we say, milestone sana in settling the Sabah issue peacefully with Malaysia. I was very involved then, but but there was an intense activity shortly after President Cory Aquino took over, assumed power, because there was an coming ASEAN summit in just within 3 months or 4 months of her assumption of office. So there was frantic activity because we cannot host. It's not nice. It's not nice to host an ASEAN summit with one of the summit members not around, and Malaysia would not have come unless we worked on this issue. So in the sidelines of preparing for the summit, we also had our frantic activity to work out the Sabah issue with Malaysia. Now, this is the point I want to make. Beyond that, wala nang nangyari until President Ramos came in. And again, we had another round of intense activity proceeding from the earlier, taking up from the earlier process. But then again, after President Ramos, the ball got dropped again, I think intentionally. And this is where we are now. In your point, Melo, that nobody seems to know in the public media, in the public, I mean, whether Malaysia is ours or not. But let me close with this point. It is ours. We had a claim. It's properly documented. We were trying to pursue it by all peaceful means. Of course, we had the Jabida, but that was a different story also related to that. We pursued it, but our effort was sporadic. Now, I don't know. I hope, Melo, this is my last point. I'm not occupying the whole thing. I just hope that from this round table, Melo, since we have elections coming up, we can really generate attention and action in this regard. Maybe not now, not during the Duterte time, but it must be in the public discourse. Thank you, Melo.
Yes. Professor Banlawi, you're now with us, right? Tell us more
Yeah.
about your thoughts on Sabah and its security implications.
Well,
Professor?
first, Melo, good morning to everybody. Good morning. Historical and current developments already complicated the issue in Sabah. But what we know is that Sabah used to be part of the Manjapahit Empire, and then there was a rebellion in Brunei, and then the Sulu Sultanate assisted the Sultan of Brunei to quell the rebellion, and as a reward for that help, the Sultan of Brunei gave the territory of Sabah to the Sultanate of Sulu. But the British colonial empire complicated the issue because it took control of that area. So when it granted independence to a territory called Malaya, then Sabah was included. So that started the Malaysian claim over Sabah. So when the Malaysian Republic was declared in 1963, it incorporated Sabah in its territory. And of course, the Philippine government contested that. And until now, we continue to claim Sabah as part of our territory. But what are the security implications? A lot of security implications. One major security problem in the area is illegal migration, because for a long time now, since the ancient period, many people there surrounding the littoral state of Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines, they used to move around that area without restrictions. But after the end of the Second World War, there was declaration of independent republics in the area. Then that started to demarcate the lines. So people did not know those demarcation lines. They just move as they used to do, during the ancient period. So right now, the because Sulu and Sabah are just geographically proximate, a lot of people from Sulu have been going back and forth to Sabah, and many people from Sulu also have a lot of relatives in Sabah, and there are significant numbers of Tausug population in Sabah, and right now around 500,000 of people in Sabah are considered to be undocumented, coming from the province of Sulu and Tawi-Tawi. So that's the problem now. And so these people, talking about undocumented, are people of non-existence. They are neither Malaysian citizen or Philippine citizen, but we know that they are Tausug. So illegal immigration is causing a lot of security problems, because, if you're undocumented, you suffer poverty, and if you suffer poverty, you will be enticed to get involved in a lot of criminal activities. So dyan napapang kidnap or ransom activities of the Abu Sayyaf group, and smuggling activities of uh, criminal organizations there, and also smuggling of goods. So those are security threats. But the number one security concern right now of both the Philippines and Malaysia in that area is the activity of foreign terrorist fighters associated with the Islamic State. And we know that Sabah became the transit point of foreign terrorist fighters going to southern Philippines in order to strengthen what they call the East Asia Wilaya of the Islamic State. So that's the primary security threat there. But based on the study made by United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, they also identified a lot of security problems in the area, and these security problems are in fact related with maritime crimes in the area. Like for example, the area has become haven for maritime piracy and armed robbery at sea. And that is why Malaysia, Philippines, and Indonesia have decided to undergo the coordinated patrol in the area through their trilateral cooperation in order to ensure safety and security of that maritime domain. And aside from that, We have seen a lot of crime happening there, like not only terrorism at sea, but also illicit trafficking of drugs, firearms trafficking, and of course human smuggling. And now recently being recognized by international community is fisheries crime and also smuggling of endangered living
Species.
things and marine resources in those areas.
Uh-huh.
So a lot of traditional and non-traditional security problems are in fact happening right now in Sabah. And that is why there's now what we call the rejuvenation of the effort to intensify the implementation of BIM IAGA, the Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, East Asian Growth Area, in order to pay attention to these areas, in order to address that. And this is another development, Amelo. China has become interested to also take actions on the situation in the area, particularly in the Sulusi and Celebes Sea. And they're interested to take part in the BIM IAGA efforts.
Okay. I'd like to pose this question to the good ambassador and to Romel. I was in China some years ago, and we met with the descendants of the Sultan of Sulu. And they said the Chinese have treated them quite well. In fact, they're allowed to practice their religion. Now, if China would still maintain that kind of relationship with the Sultanate of Sulu, what implications do you see? Mr. Ambassador, you're familiar with this,
Well,
please.
for me, it's not a matter of implication, Melo. The relationship has been established since the time of the Sultan of Sulu then. And what is the story there? The Sultan of Sulu went to China to pay tribute. Okay, so at that point in time, that implies there was already relationship between China and the Sultanate of Sulu. But why are they there? As you know, the Sultan of Sulu died en route coming back to Sulu. And the
Mhm.
Chinese, China way back then gave the Sultan of Sulu all the honors of a burial place and brought some relatives if they wanted to. That's why there are some relatives of the Sultan of Sulu living there right now. Now, so what does that indicate? At that time, there was no geopolitical issues between the Sulu and the China. It was just really trading. That's why, as I said, I use the word tribute because that is what is in the history books, that the Sultan of Sulu went to Beijing to pay tribute. But he died along the way, and up to now, if you said you visited the place, China has given the Sultan of Sulu all the honors due to a sovereign.
Okay. Pardon my ignorance, Mr. Ambassador. If the Sultan of Sulu paid tribute to the Chinese authorities at the time, could it be possible that the Philippines was under China's control, if you may?
I would really suggest for those interested in that question, just read the history books because China never extended any active influence, whether political or commercial. But trading carried on. We have in our midst a lot of ethnic Chinese, and that is all what they do. They just want to do business. They just want to trade. So at that point in time, you might even hear the expeditions of Zheng He, which which was the biggest,
Navy
largest.
at the time.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
right. That it went to a lot of places. There are even unconfirmed reports that they also reached the United States ahead of
Christopher Columbus.
Christopher Columbus. Yes, but what happened when after the last expedition of Zheng He, and he brought a lot of again tribute gifts instead of arms and whatever, uh, uh, China destroyed the fleet. In short, it was never interested in extending hegemony. And
Okay.
I'd like to stop there. Yeah.
Yes. Romel, your thoughts, please.
Well, Melo, right now, I am examining current scholarly narratives of Chinese scholars when it comes to China's historical relations with countries in Southeast Asia, and there are a lot of new stories being shared by Chinese scholars right now. Right, for example, when it comes to China's relationship with Brunei, they claim that in the ancient times. Brunei pledged allegiance to the Ming Dynasty, and therefore the Brunei became part of the territorial protection of the Imperial China. And because Sulu Sultanate also paid tribute to China 600 years ago, they considered that the Sulu Sultanate was part of the protectorate of the
Chinese
Chinese
Empire.
Empire. And the reason why Spain colonized the Philippines because of not because of the Philippines per se, but because of the intention of the Spanish colonial empire to have access to China. So our importance to Spain was because of their interest to access China and also dominate China at that time. So that was now the new narratives being shared by current scholars right now, indicating that Southeast Asia has become an integral part of China's what they call the bigger family in Asia, and
Okay.
with China as the big brother. So and China is articulating that kind of narrative in order to tell its neighbors that we have been part of this big family a long time ago, so we need to revive this kind of relationship, close relationship, where China will be viewed not as a dominant power but as a big brother in Asia, okay, willing to provide assistance, protection to all neighbors through its
Okay.
concept of a good neighborliness policy. So that's the kind of narrative now that China is articulating, and that is why China now has great interest to also enter into discussions on the security issues happening in Sulu and Celebesi, and also expressing great interest to have active involvement in the implementation of BIP Iyaga initiatives.
Okay. Mr. Ambassador, Secretary Locsin mentioned that he'd like to reopen the office which will deal with Sabah. What particular office is this? Will you please refresh our memory?
Uh, uh, can I carry on from
Okay.
Professor
All right.
Banlawi before I go to that? Because the
Okay.
matter of security and what China's interest in the Sulawesi Sea has also another angle. It is archipelagic sea lanes passage. We have not designated our archipelagic sea lanes, but the that right is in the UNCLOS that archipelagic states who have not designated archipelagic sea lanes must allow archipelagic sea lanes passage as using the routes traditionally used for such passage from one part of the high seas to another part of the high seas. Now, I raised this point, Melo, because there was an incident about how many months ago, just recently, that a Chinese Navy vessel transited that part, and there was a big hullabaloo in the Philippines because a lot of people, this is really a matter of appreciating the rules. A lot of people in the Philippines thought that was not cricket, that was not proper. Then later, the Navy came into Navy came into the picture that they should have asked for permission. Maybe so. But that is another point. The point is the Chinese Navy and any navy of any country have the right to pass through those points because that is archipelagic sea lanes. That can be an exercise of archipelagic sea lanes passage that we cannot deny for any reason, except one minor exception. Anyway, I want to go to your question about yes. As I said, this is to continue from what I said earlier. We had a process going on from the time of President Diosdado Macapagal all the way up to recently. uh, we established a North Borneo office in which all documents were there. Now, unfortunately, that burned down close to Christmas Day, sometime in the late 70s, and it has not been reconstituted. Uh, well, probably you would ask the question why. I would say there was nothing more to reconstitute from that burned office. We had a few other records in our Department of Foreign Affairs library, but again, this was all in Padre Faura. That library also burned down
Okay,
completely.
Mr. Ambassador, do you think it was coincidental that these facilities got burned, or was it intentional?
I would like to keep. I have my own thoughts, Mela, if I may say so. But there were proper investigations, and the culprit is supposed to be faulty electrical wiring. Well, it can be a convenient excuse simply because those were all buildings there. Then that is the present Supreme Court building now. Yeah. So
Yes.
I won't answer that question directly.
All right. It's as if we usually hear this, the butler did it. Anyway, uh, Professor Banlawi, you're still there. Uh, just your thoughts, no? There are international law issues, no? However, uh, what is our appreciation to all this? Oh, man, nawala si Professor Banlawi, but he'll be back in a short while. Mr. Ambassador, there are international law issues, and regrettably, our appreciation of international law is by and large underdeveloped. What are your thoughts about this?
Well, I would say that talking about rule of law and international law, this was I knew this, but this was openly cited by Secretary Blas Ople before. When he visited China, he was informed that China had 2,000 scholars studying international law, including law of the sea. How about us? I mean, you give the answer yourself in terms of comparison. So it's not really surprising that while we mouth the rule of law, there is quite a big deficiency in our knowledge of the law, especially, and this is what I regret so much, especially in the public media, in the public domain. Uh, People seems to be uh, mouthing international law on an what we call in another field in music on an uwido basis, So anyway, I'm not presenting myself as an expert, but I did write quite a few articles, which has been downloaded in academia.edu, and I might be able to download another article in the next few days, which am timing uh, for whoever cares to read it. But for myself, the timing is the start of the political campaign, and now the political campaign for the elections of 2022. My aim is not to teach, but only to present an alternative narrative so that critical people can have a look at it to be better informed when the next administration comes into the picture. Thank you, Mel.
Okay, all right. That's very good. However, looking at the makeup of the both houses and of Congress, I feel very seldom can we get people who can talk sense about these issues. But anyway, uh, Mr. Recto Mercene and Joyce Rocamora and Michael Joe Delizo are with us. They may have some questions. Please let me know. Recto, let's start. You're one of the more senior reporters in the Department of Foreign Affairs. I know you have concerns. Recto? Recto? Or Joyce? Joyce? Yes, Recto. Recto?
Ah,
Go ahead.
yes. How can we start? Is there any proposal how to start the negotiation since it appears that Secretary Locsin has started the ball rolling about the Sabah issue?
Okay. So how do we start? Mr. Ambassador, how do we start?
Well, the way we do it in the diplomatic field, we send out feelers first. We just don't go to the public media, Twitter or whatever, and start talking something, which has not been cleared with the other side. That is all I'm saying. I'm retired now. I don't know whether that is the way to go. But during my time, and I was under General Carlos Romulo and Under Secretary Jose Ingles, who were the big minds in the Department of Foreign Affairs then. First, we do quiet consultations. No, in that friendly and quiet atmosphere, you usually get positive results. And so you have to carry on from there. Now, let me advert back to what happened from before. That was how it was always done, and there was positive responses from Malaysia. That's why things carried on until I think things got to be too hot for Malaysia and it just dropped out. Thank you.
Do you think that's the way to go? Yes, you have a follow-up. Yes, please go ahead. Recto?
Salamat lang.
Okay.
Thank you, Ambassador Encomienda. Salamat.
Okay. Mr. Ambassador, yung bang sistema na mag-Twitter ka na walang feelers muna sa kabilang partido, do you think that's undiplomatic?
Undiplomatic can be a reflection of character, but the thing is, it cannot produce results. It cannot produce results. So I don't really think that is a very productive or constructive direction.
Yeah. In fact, there are quarters who say that it may just be a way for people to start talking and probably look into the sense of nationalism so that when the good secretary runs for the Senate, yun na raw yun. Pero hindi naman siguro ganun kababaw yun. No? Mr. Ambassador?
My question to you, Melo, is you saying like that, do you want to be taken out of YouTube too? Just a joke.
You know,
No.
some people are just
No.
people are just saying na baka
Okay.
ganun. Pero
Okay.
anyway, okay.
Well,
Yeah.
you connected something to the politics. I'm not that in that direction, but I was always objecting, even never, not by the use of Twitter, because that is not how you conduct diplomacy. For example, what Secretary Locsin is doing, but the bigger example is what President Trump is doing, had been doing. It's never constructive because number one, as Secretary of Foreign Affairs, you do not mouth things offhand. You have to consult your people in the field or in the or in the Department of Foreign Affairs. You have to consult them first before saying something. That's why in the traditional way, I have to refer to the traditional way because I've long retired, and that is how we did it before. But it was very polite and very considerate, and for me, it always produced results. Things in the initial phase, at least, using the Saba issue, it was done quietly. We had a policy direction, we had a program of action, and I think that is why Malaysia had to drop out. It cannot sustain its own side. But that, I must say, it was done very effectively about managing and presenting our claim to Sabah, except that now I may be taken out of YouTube, but this is what I referred to twice in that long string of activities. The ball was dropped, and this time I will say intentionally.
So you would say, Ms. Ambassador, it was more of a mea culpa or mea maxima culpa?
Mea maxima 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 culpa.
All right. Wow, medyo mabigat yun. We're joined by engineer...
Question, Melo.
Okay. Recto. Recto, go ahead.
Melo, may I ask a follow-up? In the process of renewing our claim to Sabah, is it not imperative that the Philippines should unite as one instead of knowing that there are people in government who actually intentionally drop the ball to our claim?
Intentionally drop the ball.
Dapat magkaisa muna tayo.
Okay. Well taken,
Yeah,
Recto.
hindi ba dapat ma-unify po?
Okay. Yes, Ms. Ambassador, before I introduce another panelist. Yes,
Well, Recto mentioned the word renew. I don't think we need to renew anything because we never suspended anything, except that we have to continue from where we left off before. That is my point. And the unity that Recto has mentioned, I think it will necessarily be there if the people were properly informed, if there is transparency. Then we can consult with the Malaysians whether we can take off from where we left off and see the reactions, and not through Twitter. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. All right. May tanong si Joyce Rocamora, follow up din sa tanong ni Recto. Aside from quiet discussions with Malaysia, what else can we do to uphold our claim sa Sabah multilaterally, Mr. Ambassador?
Well, what I mentioned about negotiations with Malaysia, that is part of a process. Now, if we can go back in history, and this is all documented in many proper speeches in the United Nations, we talk to Malaysia, and this is open in the United Nations, that our preference is to submit the case to the International Court of Justice. Now, in fact, even with that proposition, we were already very transparent in the UN and in our own action plan and action program. We were very transparent in regard to the documents we are ready to submit to the International Court of Justice. And why the International Court of Justice? Even that had a, shall we say, legal grounding. Number one, our issue is in Malaysia. Our claim with Malaysia is a legal issue. That is the position we took. And under, I think, I'm not sure about this, I think it's Article 43 of the UN Charter, legal issues must be referred to the ICJ, being the designated principal judicial agency of the United Nations. That was in the open all the time up to the time of President Marcos. But beginning from President Justado Macapagal. Thank you.
Okay. We're joined by Engineer Abet Ijirani. Siya po yung Secretary General ng Sultanate of Sulu. Welcome to the discussions, Engineer Abet, and nice to see you again. Welcome to the discussions, and we're happy to have you with us. Yes, please. Teka, sandali po. Naka-mute pa yata kayo. Paki-unmute lang. Let's try it. Yes. Okay, good.
Thank you very much, Melo, for having me. And in the presence now of His Excellency the Ambassador, this is a good discussion because we would be enlightening the Filipino people not only about the legal rights, our legal rights, but including our historic rights. Now,
Okay.
I came across with the hearing of the statement of the ambassador that our country, our government is ready in terms of providing any agencies about the historical and legal documents anent to the Sabah issue. And the Sultanate of Sulu, under the leadership of Sultan Pugdalon Kiram II, would be ready to provide any assistance in terms of documents to the Philippine government should it decide to pursue the Sabah claim either in the United Nations or in the International Court of Justice.
Okay. Let me ask you, how is the Sultanate of Sulu? Because it's been reported that the Sultanate is in a way parang hindi nagkakaunawaan, may fragmentation. So how do you plan to pursue the claim, engineer?
Well, Melo, it's the idea is a misnomer, considering that Malaysia has the document inherited from Great Britain, not only about how it acquired title of sovereignty, but including the 1939 Macassa's judgment, whereby under the decision of Chief Justice McCaskey of the British Court, it mentioned about the 9 principal heirs. So in the issue of Sabah, there are 2 issues involved. One is sovereignty and the other is proprietary. And this was a mutual agreement entered into between the government of the Philippines and the Sultan of Sulu before filing the case in the United Nations in that year. And so I think Malaysia is just escaping from the truth. It created its preference on how to resolve the issue by always saying,
Yes.
by always saying that the heirs are fragmented, when in fact they can base the resolution on the decision made by Chief Justice McCaskey judgment, whereby the 9 principal heirs of Sultan Jamalul Kiram II are mentioned and easily to be contacted if Malaysia is readily to resolve the issue peacefully with not only with the Philippine government, but with the heirs of the Sultan of Sulu.
Okay. Engineer, nawala yung video ninyo. Hindi na kita makita. Paki-on lang po ng camera, please. Ambassador.
Nag-low battery. Nag-low battery kasi. No.
All right. All right. Okay na. Mr. Ambassador, your reaction, please.
Yes, because I was part as a gopher. I was a junior officer when all this were actually happening. This was what I referred to earlier as frantic developments leading to shortly after President Cory Aquino assumed office, in order to put things in order bilaterally between Malaysia and the Philippines to have a very conducive as third ASEAN summit. Now, in the course of the process, let me just narrate this thing. The Malaysian side agreed that the Macassa's judgment will be the basis for the settling the proprietary rights. But Malaysia, and quite understandably, we understood that, wanted to talk to only one among the 9 in behalf of the 9. Because in the view of Malaysia, you talk separately to all the 9. That would be very, very unwieldy. And I would in a way agree to that. But this is, of course, my personal account already, but it's officially reflected. The 9 heirs, I'm sorry to say that it was no less than Secretary Manglapus who was leading the way to bring them together. 7 would agree, but there were 3 who would not. Now, I don't know who those people are, but that was the state of play at the time, that Malaysia agreed to settling the proprietary rights. based on the McCaskey judgment that laid out 9 heirs, but in the practical side of the settlement, the the heirs could not choose who among themselves could speak for the 9. Secretary Manglapos took over, but he was still unsuccessful. Thank you.
Okay.
That's
Uh,
just my account. That's just my account.
all right. Very interesting indeed. You worked under several secretaries of foreign affairs. As far as you recall, Mr. Ambassador, who among the foreign secretaries you worked with had a clear idea of the Sabah issue?
I'm sorry, I may have again to be taken out of YouTube, but all the secretaries of foreign affairs had clear ideas. Why? From the time of Secretary Narciso Ramos, everything has been laid out in terms of of course we did not have the transparency that we are having now in our modern times, but everything was laid out in terms of our of the process, in terms of Philippines position, but there were gaps because that is what I said when the ball was dropped. But I must say the secretaries of foreign affairs had full knowledge of the situation, and they
Well,
were very actively involved when they were brought into the picture.
have you ever entertained thoughts, Mr. Ambassador, that some people who may have been in a position to drop the ball made money along the way?
I would not go to as far as to the point that somebody made money, but definitely there was something behind it that caused the dropping of the ball twice.
So, so there was a hidden hand somewhere,
Yes,
and
but
it
it
remains hidden.
yes, yes, but that's fine with me if there is a foreign hand. What I cannot take is the supposed nationalistic side of the participants there, patriotic and nationalistic.
Okay. There are some questions here. Which mode of acquisition of territory as recognized in international law is the Philippines invoking in respect of its claim of sovereignty over Sabah? Mr. Ambassador, and probably the good engineer. Yes.
Uh, for me, there's really no question about it. We don't have to reread history. Everything is clear, as the engineer pointed out. Everything is clear. All the documents are there, except that, well, the engineer's documents are intact, but ours in the DFA, as I said, have been burned twice. And if the engineer and the government can come together to reconstruct those
Documents.
documents, then we could just probably again sound out Malaysia. Can we settle this once and for all? Because that was the last word in the process of in the whole process before Malaysia dropped out. That we agreed for the Sabah to join Malaysia on the condition that that we may have to pursue it depending upon the results of what was anticipated as a route to the International Court of Justice. The point is, I don't know whether I explained it clearly, but in the process was we go to the International Court of Justice, and if the International Court of Justice said, President Marcos said this very clearly, if the International Court of Justice says it's not yours, then that's the end of it for us. But even if the Federation of Malaysia includes Sabah at that point in time, we will not object except that our claim persists in that sense.
Okay. Another question is commencing a case or arbitration a recommended course of action to resolve this territorial dispute? What obstacles does the Philippines expect?
Okay, uh, that's a good question because it might highlight another area of conflict for us, the South China Sea. But the question is is that the best recourse? No, no. Let me be very clear. Resort to the International Court of Justice or so-called third-party settlement is a peaceful mode of settling disputes. But if you look at the UN Charter, Chapter 7, there is a listing. It's not in specific order, but among the Pacific settlement of disputes, there is a, a selection you can choose. Are negotiations, which is always first, negotiations. So for whatever we do now, we have to start negotiating, even if there was a process already that happened. Either negotiations, inquiry, mediation, conciliation, and recourse to third-party settlement. It is in the last. It's not supposed to be in a sequence of priority. No, but still resort. It is the highlight is always a settlement between the parties, whether negotiations, inquiry, mediation, conciliation, anything. Finally, a recourse to the to judicial settlement. That is always recommended to be in the last part. It is meant to be seen to be the most assertive among the, but there is no sequence there.
Okay,
To
Mr.
the question,
Ambassador,
yes.
quickly, they say diplomacy is both an art and science, wherein things are said, but nothing is accomplished. So, paano
Well,
tayo?
well, I'm not ready to say it that way because talking about diplomacy and negotiations, what happens in international relations? You have to deal with other countries, whether
Yeah.
bilaterally, whether regionally, or internationally.
Okay,
So, what is the alternative? You go out there and Twitter and fight? No, that's not,
no
that
way.
was never done during our time.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you for the encouraging statement. Engineer Abe, kumusta na ang Sultanate of Sulu dahilan sa, well, whether we like it or not, people are mired in poverty in your area. And there are economic migrants in Sabah. Ano ba ang status ngayon? Give us a clear bird's eye view of what's going on. Teka, naka-mute pa po kayo.
Okay.
Go
Hello,
ahead.
hello.
Yes.
Now, the economic uh, aspiration of people in Sulu, whether it would be positive or in the negative atmosphere, is always reflected of the economic crisis brought about by the 5 decades or imminent GRP conflict. In fact, prior to that, prior to the contemporary idea about the status of Filipinos in Sabah, we have to recall history, Melo, that after the MNLF, internationally known MNLF GRP conflict broke out, immediately Malaysia announced the opening up of territories to the refugee affected by the Mindanao War from 1972 until 1995. So people migrated. Now, because of that, the economic situation in the Sulu archipelago was so much affected, and so people were forced to migrate. Now, people answering the questions from interviews conducted by Philippine media about their status and seeing that they have positive, what do you call that, positive kind of living in that area is brought about by fear towards repression by the Malaysian authority in Sabah. Because if they say otherwise, Malaysia would pick them up immediately. Malaysian authority would pick them up immediately and deport them to the Philippines. Now, that is the condition. So that the Sultanate of Sulu is really hoping that our government will take seriously the matter. in pursuing the Sabah claim. But prior to that, Melo, I hope you can you still hear me, Melo?
Yes, please. Yes, please. Go ahead.
Prior to that, I would like to positively react to the statement of the Honorable Ambassador of His Excellency regarding what happened during the conference in Malacanang, held between the ears and Secretary Manglapos before President Cory Aquino. I have here, what do you call that? A news clipping from the Inquirer that the reason why a mutual agreement between the two parties, meaning the government of the Philippines and under the administration of President Cory Aquino and the heirs did not materialize because the government unilaterally chose only Secretary Manglapos to become the spokesperson in matters of resolving the proprietary rights. Now, the stand of the heirs was that they would like to be represented only by the president, by the Philippine government, following or in compliance with the 1962 agreement separating proprietary issues from the sovereignty issue. Now, I would like also to say majority that all the 9 principal heirs reacted negatively for not being a member of the negotiating panel to talk about the settlement of the proprietary. Now, however, I will not dwell so much on that, Melo, as it has a documentary evidence as being published by the Inquirer in the chair, mentioning about what I have just said. Now, in matters of the Sabah issue, first of all, there was an agreement entered into between the Philippine government and Malaysia in 1963 as far as the inclusion or incorporation of Sabah into the Federation of Malaysia. That document was, that agreement was embodied in the 1963 Manila Accord. And that Manila Accord should be the guiding light of the Philippine government in discussing the issue with Malaysia because Malaysia agreed, that to the proposition that the inclusion of Sabah into the Federation of Malaysia does not mean an end to the continued interest of both Malaysia, the Philippines, and Indonesia in discussing about the issue until finally resolved by the United Nations. Now, in matters of how Malaysia treated the proprietary issue, Melo, in 1977, during the Kuala Lumpur conference, President Marcos announced that he would like to resolve the issue. Immediately, the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Hussein Ong, reacted that he would only want to deal the monetary settlement with the heirs of the Sultan of Sulu. Now, aside from that, the issue is about whom to talk with the 9 principal heirs. Malaysia is also denying the position of late Datuk Punjongan Kiram as administrator of the state territory of Sabah, who can speak for and in behalf of the 8 principal heirs. So Malaysia is only confusing the Filipino people, especially our government officials, in matters to directly resolve the issue about Sabah.
Okay. Yes, Ambassador, please.
Well, I'd just like to make it clear that the matter of the heirs, as we gather from engineer, yes, that their objection had to do with the office of the foreign instead of the office of the president handling that issue. Well, there are some ramifications further there, but the big point there is Malaysia, and I agreed with this, wants to talk only to one person, whether from the heirs, and from my impression then, the heirs could not agree among themselves who will represent them. And so Secretary Manglapos was brought in to be the spokesman. It had nothing to do with government interference in the matter of the proprietary rights. Things were moving very fast at the time that perhaps we could have found a better one to uh, represent the heirs of their one of their own choice. But things were moving very fast at the time, and with it was thought that if you put in Secretary Manglapus, things he's a very good. He has his track record in politics and being very persuasive. He could manage it. It did not happen. But let me repeat, our participation then, whether President of the Philippines or Secretary Manglapus, was not because the government was dipping its fingers into the proprietary rights. It only wanted to be helpful to precisely resolve the issue of the proprietary rights, thinking that of course, the stature of these government officials could help. Thank you.
All right, we're joined by Dr. Romel Banlawi. He's back, and I'm happy he's back. There are certain concerns from the Sultanate of Sulu. Did I get it right that there are issues which the good Dr. Banlawi may have failed to see? Ano nga yun, Abe?
Uh, the conflict in Mindanao in the position of the Sultanate of Sulu is brought about by the Jabeda massacre, whereby it gave opportunity to the Malaysian government to intervene in the affairs of the Sultan, in the affairs of the Philippine government. And so from that massacre, however perceived by others as hoax, generated the chance for Malaysia to discuss matters more importantly to them than to the Muslim Filipinos of joining an advocacy in the pretext using Sabah in order that the Muslim Filipinos in the Philippines would join in hand with Malaysia in disturbing the governmental affairs of our country. And so, in order to continue the Malaysian involvement, is that secretly the question could arise: why are they allowing their nationals not being immediately checked in their country to create and sabotage the peaceful and tranquility of our country? These are the questions that I believe our National Security Council has to brought up before the National Security Council of Malaysia.
Okay. Romel, would you care to react to that and welcome back? Welcome home?
Sorry,
Professor, good
dalawang
morning.
radyo ang makiusap
It's
sa
all
atin
right.
sa nangyayari sa West Philippine Sea. So, unang-una, dapat nating maunawaan na Melo na may posisyon yung Malaysian government tungkol sa Sabah at kino-consider ng Malaysia na Sabah will always be part of Malaysia. At tayo naman, sinasabi natin na Sabah is not Malaysia and it has been part of the Philippines. Pero dapat din natin makita yung isa pang anggulo, Melo, na mismo sa loob ng Sabah ay may movement kung saan gusto nilang magkaroon ng sovereign Sabah, meaning a sovereign state, a separate sovereign state. Kumbaga, may ganyang movement diyan sa area na yan. So, sila yung mga mamamayan doon na nag-advocate na gusto rin din nila na maging independent state sila na not part of Malaysia and not part of the Philippines. So may ganyang existing narrative. Pero kung tayo ang mapag-usapan, of course, gusto natin na yung posisyon natin yung mangibabaw sa area na yan. Pero naging balakid yan sa ASEAN solidarity. Kaya dapat balikan natin kung bakit nabuo yung ASEAN. At isa sa mga primordial considerations kung bakit nabuo yung ASEAN ay when it comes to territorial disputes, ay iset aside muna yan at ang importante ay magsagawa ng cooperation among states dyan, lalong-lalo na yung BIM Iaga, napakataas ng prospects niya to encourage cooperative activities in the area, and at the same time promote security and prosperity of the people there. So kasi pag nag-aaway, naapektuhan yung mga tao. Tao ang nagiging collateral damages ng awayan ng two sovereign states. Pero kung magko-cooperate yung two sovereign states, makikinabang ang tao diyan. At ano bang dapat na isettle ng two countries when it comes to the problems of the people there? Yung unang-una, the problem of the migrants, no? So yung mga undocumented migrants na sa suspect ng Malaysian government ay nanggagaling sa Sulu and Tawi-Tawi ay dapat ma-address na maproteksyonan siya hindi lamang ng Philippine government pati rin ng Malaysian government na magkaroon ng protection of the undocumented people in Sabah kasi sila yung naapektuhan diyan. And at the same time, when it comes to a lot of security threats and criminal activities in the area, mas pag-usapan ng dalawang bansa sa halip na territorial disputes ay yung law enforcement cooperation para mapanatili yung tinatawag ni kaibigang Abe na tranquility in the area. So Malaysia should not be the source of conflict in the Philippines, and the Philippines should not be the source of conflict in Malaysia. The two countries should be sources of peaceful solutions so that the people from two nations can benefit from their cooperation. So yun dapat ang pino-focus natin. Kasi kung pag-usapan natin yung territorial disputes, nation states go to war because of territories. And we want to avoid that to happen.
Let me ask you, Professor Banlawi, where would the Filipinos be? Where would the Sultanate of Sulu be should they move to come up with an independent Sabah state, free from Malaysian interference or whatever, and free from the Philippine pressure? Where would the Sultanate of Sulu be? What will happen to our claim?
Well, that will be problematic for the Sultanate of Sulu because the Sultanate of Sulu considers Sabah as an integral part of the Sultanate. Pero gusto ng Sabah na maging independent sila. So the problem now, who are the people of Sabah? So are there the Malay, the Chinese, or the Tausugs? So those are the things that even the Sabah people need to settle and clarify. So it's really a complicated issue. Kaya nga, it's a complicated issue that instead of delving into that, we need to find ways to promote cooperative activities that will cater to the needs of the people there so that if people are satisfied, they will not clamor for independence.
Okay.
Especially if there are efforts to solidify regional cohesion in the area, yung PIM-IAGA initiative. If we can only implement the PIM-IAGA initiative, territorial issues will no longer be an issue.
Okay. Mr. Ambassador and Romel, si Joyce Rocamora of the Philippines News Agency has a question. Malaysia has submitted to the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, CLCS. What's the panel's view on this? Malaysia's claims lie close to Sabah. How should the Philippines move forward regarding this matter? Mr. Ambassador.
Well, I may have to slightly shift the discussion, but that's a very good question, Melo. Why? Because I've been saying this a long time in regard to the so-called West Philippine Sea. Firstly, I want to emphasize, I say so-called because I don't recognize it. Naming the West Philippine Sea did not follow international procedures. So I still insist on calling it South China Sea, but for purposes of this discussion, I'm willing to call it the West Philippine Sea. In regard to as these two areas have to be put together. Why? Because in our claim to Sabah, it is territorial, and it is from the territory of Sabah that we can claim an exclusive economic zone and continental shelf.
Yes.
So, if unless we settle the territorial issue, we have no business talking about. I mean, we can, like what we did in the South China Sea. We so-called bifurcated the issue, but will it really resolve anything? Let me put it this way, as clearly as possible, because this is a source of a lot of confusion. Let me shift again to the so-called West Philippine Sea. Our issue there, defined it in the Hague Permanent Court of Arbitration, is not territorial. It's only about sovereign rights. Fine. So this the Hague PCA bifurcated. It was their term. The issue, they separated the sovereign rights from sovereignty, and that is why the Hague PCA has jurisdiction there. Fine, it could possibly be done there, because the shall we say, the territorial part of it is very insignificant to us in the islands in the Spratlys. But in the Malaysian case, we cannot talk about exclusive. We cannot separate the issue there of exclusive economic zone and continental shelf, because if we are successful in establishing our claim to Malaysia, that will automatically follow. If we get Sabah, Malaysia's claim to the exclusive economic zone and continental shelf will go with it. So there should be no conflict there. But I'm glad that I'd like to connect to the one who mentioned the question in another. She has a very sharp mind. Thank you.
Of course. Romel, your thoughts?
Oo, Melo, no? For me, it's a positive sign that Malaysia submitted partially, yung their claim to extended continental shelf. So that means that it will renew the legal discussions of the issue, and for me that is better than exchanging fires in the South China Sea. At least now we will exchange legal positions. So for me, it's a good position. And but of course, ang issue diyan, Melo, is the credibility of international legal body to enforce the ruling of the International Court. Kasi nga, as based on our experience sa 216 Tribunal Award, the China and Brunei continue to reject our victory, but all other claimants are recognizing our victory, but at the same time, the enforcement, it's still difficult. The enforcement is not legal but political. So we have to strengthen the capability of the international community to enforce decisions like this. But Malaysia submitted their legal position. Then we should, if we have other legal positions, and I think we also have to do that, because that's the main spirit of UNCLOS, that if we have some problems when it comes to maritime disputes, the court was created to settle those things rather than exchange military forces in the area. So it's good to exchange legal arguments. So whoever wins in the legal discussions, so the question now is who will enforce? Because based on our experience, we won the tribunal case, but the enforcement is difficult to achieve. So we need a reform of existing international institutions to strengthen the capability of international institutions to enforce international legal decisions like our tribunal victory.
Engineer Abe, ano ang kalalagyan ng inyong claim kung magtatagumpay yung move na magkaroon ng sovereign state sa Sabah? Yes, please.
If we only base the answer, Melo, dito sa political contemporary reality, siguro the position of the Sultanate doon will decline. However, if the inhabitants of Sabah were considered that, number one, that in 1704, North Borneo was ceded to the Sultan of Sulu by the Sultan of Brunei. Number two, that the British government recognized the proprietary issue of the Sultanate of Sulu, nandoon pa rin ang kakayahan ng Sultanate of Sulu. Now, number three, in addition to that, Melo, there are about in 1990, the census conducted in Sabah was that there were about 3.2 million inhabitants in Sabah. And around 40% of the populations are coming from the Philippines, meaning from Sulu, Basilan, Tawi-Tawi, and some other parts in Mindanao, as well as in Luzon. So, if the granting of separate independence to Sabah by the Philippines and the Malaysian, and it were pushed through plebiscite, siguro nandoon pa rin ang influence ng Sultanate of Sulu, because the people those that stayed in Sabah prior to the granting of independence in 1963 to Malaysia, as well as from 1972, after Malaysia opened up the territory of Sabah, siyempre, ang gusto nila, mayroon silang participation doon sa governmental affairs kung sakasakali masiparit itong independence. Now, the only way for them to attain that right is invoking the historical and legal rights of the Sultanate of Sulu. So doon makikita, the intervention of the Sultanate of Sulu cannot be erased because naturally, the inhabitants coming from Sulu, Basilan, Tawi-Tawi will advocate for their participation and will voice out their rights as constituents of the Sultanate of Sulu.
Okay. Medyo magandang bantayan yan sapagkat nung pumunta ako sa Sabah after the signing of the agreement between the government and the MILF, ang sabi ng mga nakausap ko ron, they would rather stay in Sabah rather than return to the Philippines sapagkat mas maganda ang kita. But anyway, that's another issue we will talk about later. Siguro, yes, Ambassador, you're about to say something. Please go ahead.
I would like to point out that this supposed new movement in Sabah that Professor Banlawi said might be a red herring, because that movement, very faint, that's a very faint movement really, if you ask me. But that has been there since the time of President Marcos, and it incorporated in our own submissions. One, that let's negotiate with Malaysia, referring it to the International Court, the issue of the sovereignty, and if the International Court rules that it belongs to, that the Sultanate has no ownership of Sabah, then our position was let us submit this to a referendum. Technically, it is mentioned in the documents as ascertainment, not referendum, but let's just call it referendum. It's easier to understand that way. And further to that point of President Marcos, if in the referendum, the people of Sabah opts to join Malaysia, fine, we will not object. If the people of Sabah, of course, chooses the Philippines, then we get it. But the position paper then of President Marcos was, if the people of Sabah chooses independence, then that has to be honored. So that point about a new movement, it's not new. It has been there, but I know for a fact, because I was posted there, it's quite a very faint movement. How could that movement gain ground with the strength of the at the time, the Barisan Nacional? Okay, let me just say this. It was during my time that Sabah joined the Barisan Nacional. before
Mhm.
the time that election that I happened to be there, so I witnessed that election. uh, Sabah belonged to the opposition. And that's why I can say this openly as a testimony that no less than Dr. Anwar Ibrahim, who was the deputy prime minister, was 2 weeks in Malaysia, in Sabah, during the elections to help rally the forces. And finally, they won it. But before that time, Sabah was opposition. Another point I want to make is we seem to be thinking that Sabah is Muslim. No, it's not. Sabah is the ethnic population of Sabah, in fact, are Christians, the so-called Kadazan Christians, And so, I mean, but as I said, this might be red herrings, but I just want to point out something in order to clarify the perspective. Now,
Okay.
one final point about why, as the figures of Engineer Abe, about we practically are 40% there. I just want to add the narrative that yes, in fact, we grew and grew and grew there in population. Sabah was really nothing in terms of population, but when these issues with Malaysia came in, it really exploded. Why?
Okay.
Number one, what Engineer Abe mentioned about the Jabida massacre. Okay, that's just that's just the seed. But as Engineer Abe said, that's what got Malaysia to intervene in our domestic affairs in Mindanao. Okay, and what happened there was this big fight in Mindanao. It was said, I don't want to say this in very definitively, but it is said, and the government, that was the government's discernment, Malaysia supplied arms to the insurgency in Mindanao. And because it was a big event, we know this as a matter of history. There were lots of Filipinos, people from Mindanao who went to Sabah to avoid the conflict. Now,
Uh-huh.
it's not a simple case of that as a single cause. Number one, we a lot of Filipinos have been migrating to from Sulu have been migrating to Sabah because of the Rido culture of the Muslims. So if there are murders or whatever issues, personal crime or whatever, most of the time, many would seek asylum in Sabah. That was the beginning part. Then later
Okay.
came the well, Tabida massacre was the seed, but the big insurrection in Mindanao, that was where the big population shift happened. Now, uh, when that happened, these are figures from the international. Uh, the the UN office in charge of refugees, the office of the UN Commissioner for Refugees. At that time, and this was probably 20 years ago, there were 70,000, more than 70,000 registered Filipino refugees from the conflict in Sabah. 73,000 registered with the Commission on Human Rights. You have to multiply that so many times by now. But beyond that, the the migrations for all sorts of reasons, economic, rido, or what, continued, and that added to the population of the Filipinos in Sabah. They
Mhm.
are, and the only documented Filipinos there were the ones that were documented by the UN Commissioner of Human Rights of 73,000. I don't know whether they have continued to be documenting the progenies of those people, but the rest are undocumented. Now, let me put it this way. Oh, maybe this is a story that cannot be told. But we did
Sige
that.
nga, sige nga.
Maaalis tayo sa YouTube. But let me just say that what I said earlier, that 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 election, particular election, when the opposition lost in Sabah uh, and won by the Barisan, led by Anwar Ibrahim, the Filipinos played a very big part. I will stop on that point. But one more thing about uh, the big. I of course I hope Engineer Abe would look into this in order to connect the narrative. The big person in Sabah before was Tun Mustafa, and Tun Mustafa had roots in Sulu. Anyway, when uh, when I uh, when I assumed my post in Malaysia, I naturally visited Tun Mustafa, and I was hoping to start a narrative with him in order to establish our own positions, and just get information.
Yes.
But when I called on him, he was not yet very old. I think close to 80, but he was already very weak. And anyway, it was a very good conversation. And why? I think because what was awakened in him was his Filipino blood. We had a very good conversation. He told me that he had documents with him about Sabah, and we agreed to another meeting. What happened was he died in the meantime. So no further
Wow.
meeting.
Okay.
Maybe Abe, Engineer Abe can carry on, take that into account.
All right. Okay. May I ask
Mm.
Dr. Panlawi how he'd react to the red herring mentioned by the good ambassador?
Uh,
Romel?
Thank you, Melo. No, I fully respect Ambassador Encomienda because I really rely on his intellectual and experiential knowledge of the issue. But because I was given a privilege to observe the election of Malaysia in 2020, this is what I got from our observations. Na there is now a growing dissatisfaction from Sabah and Sarawak expressing unhappiness with the federation because the federal government failed to deliver two important promises made in 1962 prior to the declaration of independent Malaysia. First, that Sabah and Sarawak will be given high levels of autonomy. And second, that they will be given priorities in terms of economic development. Those two issues were not delivered by the federal government, and that created dissatisfaction against the federal government. So that's the area, and that triggered renewed advocacy for independence. That's why during the last year's election campaigns, the voices of independent movements in Sabah and also in Sarawak became very, very loud and were even considered by several politicians there in order to get the votes of the Sabah people. So that's the
Uh-huh.
current development. Second, when it comes to the constitution of people there, Sabah has been ethnically and religiously diverse place. And the Malay population in that area constitute the minority. So, and Abe is correct that 40% of the people there are Tausug. But no ethnic group constitute more than 40% in Sabah. So
Okay.
that's now the reality, and therefore, because of that, there are now dissatisfied movements in that area calling for an independent status.
Okay. All right. Abe, can you connect the dots? Pwede bang makonect yung mga sinabi ni Ambassador at nung mga nakausap niya noong araw?
Opo, Melo, sapagkat ang sinasabi ni Ambassador at ni Professor ay magkatugma yan. Sapagkat the demand for, first, ang unang diniman ni Jeffrey Kitingan in 1998 was for a self-autonomy. that the federal government of Malaysia mabigyan ng otonomiya ang Sabah. Now it expanded, now joining with Sarawak, na kung saan yung mga nagdedemand ay nasa Great Britain at sa Australia. Now in 2001, kadasan, before I will continue, sasabihin ko muna na there are 32 ethnic groups in Sabah. The most dominant, sabi ni Ambassador, ay Kadasan. Pangalawa, sumunod ay Inchik, and then the Badjao, the Bangsa Suluk, who are the Tausug people, and then followed by other ethnic groups. Now, yung demand nila now is for yung sovereignty rights, sapagkat tama yung sinabi ni Professor, yung dalawang promise ng Malaysia, federal government of din Malaya and Great Britain hindi nasunod. Ay hanggang ngayon, especially noong 1974, yung rights of oil na nasa Petronas na ngayon, ay kinamkam ng federal government of Malaysia. So nawalan ng pag-asa ang inhabitants to benefit from that. In fact, meron isang leader ng Kadasan sa Great Britain, si Mr. Jambon Squire, exposing this historical wrongdoings committed by the Malaysian government against the inhabitants in the British Parliament, demanding for the complete independence, separation of Sabah from mainland Malaysia. Okay. Now, so that itong pagdugtong-lugtungin natin, kaya nga sinabi ko kanina, in case magkaroon ng recognition by the United Nations yung demand nila, ay siyempre papasok yun doon sa parehong ginawa ng Malaya ang Great Britain, magkakaroon ng ascertainment of views. I agree with His Excellency the Ambassador. Yung ascertainment kasi, Melo, was only to determine the preference of people in the area. Now, no less than former Senator Tatad na nag-ikwento niya sa akin na yung ginawa ng federal government of Malaya and the British government ay hocus-pocus para lang makonvince ang United Nations na nagkaroon ng ganito. So, dito, pag halimbawa, mangyari ito, magkakaroon din ito ng unilateral discussion to arrive at a unilaterally agreed agreement among the 32 ethnic groups in Sabah. So, this will not, pag hindi ma-resolve ito ng mabuti, magkakaroon din ng negative impact after obtaining the so-called independence that the inhabitants wish to have in Sabah.
Okay. Mr. Ambassador, very briefly, ano ang yaman ng Sabah? Yung din ang tanong ko kay Romel at kay Abe. How rich is Sabah?
Well, okay. Let me put it this way. But first, I just want to say something to clarify points. When I said that it is a red herring, I didn't mean to say that it does not matter at all. When I said that, I call it a red herring because our discussion now is precisely about the issue between Malaysia about Sabah with the Sultan of Sulu. So that discussion of an independent movement in Sabah for purposes of our discussion, to me, is a red herring because that was already mentioned before. Another point is also intertemporal issues might be creeping in because when I said that the ethnic population of Sabah are Kadasan Christians, this was from the very beginning. Right now, yes, it's diverse. As Engineer Abe said, before it was really just Badjaos going back and forth Sabah and Asulu and Sabah, but now there are in fact migrants from Luzon, and this I mentioned to in my report to Manila that the southern backdoor has become a illegal migration route for mainland Malaysia, not necessarily Sabah. They use this, so but people remain. So in terms of ethnic diversity, now of course there's a lot more. There are even Indonesians there, for heaven's sake, and so I just want to clarify that point when I
Okay.
mentioned it. Now, the thing is, another thing is uh, the so-called ascertainment. Yes, it was in the documents. It was ascertainment, but I began using the word self-determination because in the UN report that is not accurate, but in the UN report, which is more widely read than our own internal documents, the UN called it self-determination. Fine, let's take that route. It was self-determination, but there was a very big flaw there that we knew from the legal office in the DFA, and we made issue out of that, but nothing happened. Uh, uh, when the UN observers went to Sabah, our own observers, led by Ambassador Bisnar, who is from Sulu, I think, were not allowed to observe until 3 days after it was finished.
Really?
On that basis alone, you can impugn the validity of that so-called self-determination. But anyway, that we can just take that into account for purposes of having our mind clear in moving forward.
Okay.
Especially reconnecting. Now, again, this might be, I don't want to let this go because this might be part of my, and I have to let it go now. The matter of BIMP Iaga, yes, that was precisely part of our issue in managing the issues, That was, I mentioned the name of President Ramos so many times because it was at this time that a lot of activity happened, and I happened to be his ambassador to Malaysia. BIMP Iaga was precisely agreed upon directly by Prime Minister Mahathir and President Ramos during the state visit of President Ramos, at the official visit at the time. Well, I have to say this because it was very dramatic. Um, uh, in a way, when President Mark Ramos
Ramos.
arrived in the afternoon of that day, let's be quite picky about the dates, he called me to his suite. Okay, just upon arrival, we had official dinner. Then after official dinner, we went to our respective suites. The aides called me up at 10 o'clock in the evening. Nakapajama na ako. And he said, President Ramos wants to see me. I had to rush to his suite. And this is something I admire with President Ramos. I must say this very clearly. He asks for the opinion of the people in the field. He has been fed with a lot of position papers, briefing papers, everything. But on that very eve of the meeting of Mahathir, he called for me 10 o'clock in the evening and he told me, sit down. Then he said, so what now? And I said, Mr. President, we know what the briefing papers contain, but I suggest very strongly, now this may not be able to happen again, but I said but it happened in that time. Mr. President, I think you have to go it would be best if you could go one-on-one first. President Ramos was silent. Then he just looked up to me and said, okay, I'll think about it overnight. That was the less than a minute, 2 minutes, we were finished in that conversation.
Mhm.
Early morning, 6 o'clock in the morning, I was awakened because the reputation of President Ramos is up by 3 o'clock.
Yes.
And I was summoned again by the aide. So I had to rush to President Ramos, and he said, okay, I think let's go for one-on-one. And I'm sorry, I really just want to get this off because it's very important. In revealing how Malaysia can react depending upon the approach. Now, so that was 6 o'clock. We were already gathering for breakfast for the first event of the day, and I called my counterpart. Of course, I said, Rastam, my president wants one-on-one. Oh my God, he exploded. He said, Alberto, how can you do this? We have been preparing everything. It's ready. How can you do this? I said, I'm just conveying to you what my president told me to convey to you. It's up to you what you do with that. So he turned around very flabbergasted. He said, I don't know how this can happen, but I'll convey it to my prime minister anyway. In less than 5 minutes, he called me up by phone. I mean, in less than 5 minutes, he was already running towards me, waving his right hand. He said, it's on, it's on. End of the story. And we went to breakfast. At the first event, President Ramos and Prime Minister Mathir went on a closed session by themselves, and it took more than an hour. That Secretary Romulo impatiently asked me, Dodong, what's happening? I said, I don't know. They just decided to talk. Anyway, when they finally came out, both were smiling. And what did they discuss? It was BIMP Iaga. Now, the problem with BIMP Iaga is, again, well, the first meetings happened during my watch. It was in Kuching. But then again, we dropped the ball. That's why BIMP Iaga, with all the enthusiasm of Professor Banlawi, has not taken off.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, very short. How rich is Sabah? Is it very rich?
Okay, going back to that issue, I have some reluctance. Okay. Check out Malaysia. Malaysia is among the biggest oil producers in the world. Where are those fields? It is in Sabah and Sarawak, and I think Sabah has even more.
Okay.
There are, in fact, talking about disaffection that Engineer Abe said. One of the disaffection is precisely that oil money from Sabah is never audited. Okay. And there are rumors, or not rumors, but you can see it physically. It is the oil money of Sabah that built up Kuala Lumpur.
Okay.
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 And
let's leave it at that.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. We leave it at that. But
Yeah.
other riches, lumber. How big is Sabah? How big are the virgin forests? That's why that's another part of the population in Sabah are Filipino workers working in the logging companies of Sabah.
Okay.
And also Indonesians. And that adds to the mix. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ambassador. Romel, as far as you know, how rich is Sabah? Romel?
First, Sabah is very rich in biodiversity. Agriculture, as mentioned by Ambassador Encomienda, very rich in palm oil, rubber, and in terms of forestry, virgin forest, the rainforest there is very attractive, not only for different living things, but also for tourism purposes. And of course, yung petroleum industries in the area, particularly yung natural gas. So it's really producing a lot of resources that can fuel the overall economic development of Malaysia. So very rich talaga ang Sabah. And almost 30% of the total GDP of Malaysia depends on the economic activities happening in Sabah. And even the Sabah Economic Development and Investment Authority is intensifying its plans in order to convert Kota Kinabalu as Asia's most livable cities and a hub for global economic activity. So it's really huge. And not mentioned ito, this is the favorite also of Ambassador Encomienda. Sabah also is also located in the what we call the Coral Triangle, where you can find a lot of corals in the area, very rich in marine resources. So it's just really awesome. Awesome.
All right. Abe?
Yes.
How rich is Sabah?
According to our source in 2016, ang GDP ng Sabah is 120 billion US dollars. Not considering pa yung mga smuggled out by smugglers in the area. Yun ay nakulikta lang ng Federation of Malaysia. Now, tama yung sinabi ni Ambassador, ni Professor, lahat ng mga natural resources ay nandoon, including what the tourists can behold, yung beauty ng Sabah.
Okay.
Kaya nga, in relation to that, I agree with the two good resource speakers na dapat pag-usapan ang territorial disputes, i-resolve sapagkat yung binanggit ni Professor sa turista, pwede mo i-link ang Sabah through Terter Island or from lahat na to Cebu to. Linking all this, ito na ang matawag na one Southeast Asian nation. Now, yun ang punto why we have to resolve talaga itong territorial disputes.
Okay.
Now, going back again to the question, kaya nga yumayaman ang mainland Malaysia Peninsula, totoo yung sinabi ni Ambassador na ang all developments in Kuala Lumpur ay pera ng Sabah at Sarawak. Kaya nga, according to Professor Banlawi, na kinakailangan na ng mga inhabitants to demand for a complete independence of Sabah from the Federation of Malaysia.
Okay. The reason I ask the question is very simple. I was in West Timor, I was in East Timor, and looking at East Timor, it's a small province of Indonesia, and yet it became independent. It became a country on its own. There was some blood spilled, but East Timor is now a republic. It's called Timor-Leste, and it is surviving on its resources, which is oil in East Timor Sea, right? And this is in partnership with Australia. So I'm just looking at some recent events. If this is the condition in Sabah, there is a possibility that it can become an independent country and survive on its resources. And that is what makes the Sabah claim more problematic, if you may. Yun ang isang sitwasyon. Anyway, very briefly, bago ako magtanong ng huling tanong, very briefly, ano ang nakikita ninyong kinabukasan doon sa Sabah claim? Romel, from a security point of view, where are we headed?
I think security problems in Sabah, particularly in the larger Sulu Sea and Celebes Sea, will in fact encourage the littoral states, particularly the Philippines and Malaysia, to cooperate rather than compete. Because if they continue to compete on territorial issues in Sabah, all these organized crimes, all these criminal activities will prosper, and that will be inimical to the security and prosperity of both countries. So the need to cooperate is really essential.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Mr. Ambassador, your thoughts? Where are we headed? Unmute lang po. Oops, teka, naka-mute pa po kayo. Teka po, naka-mute pa po kayo. Sandali lang. Please unmute.
Okay,
Yeah, go. Yes, Ambassador.
Firstly, there was a sign that it was you who muted me, so I did not. That's what I did not. I did not talk. But looking forward, I think, as I said, we have to put things together again, simply because there was a good process going on. The ball was dropped twice on the political side. Okay, but I want to comment on about the status of the Sultan of Sulu, just again for perspective. Malaysia, this of course, Engineer Abe knows this very much. The 7 sultanates of Malaysia in mainland Malaysia, they were sovereign entities, and they are treated that way. But and Sulu, and as with the Sultan of Brunei, they had interaction in the olden times with those sultanates in the mainland. And but I don't know, I'm not assigning any blame. I just want to mention the fact that the sovereignty of the Sultanate of Sulu has been cheapened in the process. I think I would like to, if I may say something to Engineer Abe, they must
Please.
build up on that point about the sovereignty of the Sultanate of Sulu. And there was one move that I understand at that time, I got it from the newspapers, where you canceled the deed of cession to the government of the Philippines. You have to look into that again to assert yourself. You are
Thank
not
you. Thank you.
you are not any significant
Thank you.
presence here. Now, one last thing about this is my final thing, Melo, if we're running out of time, about the movement again in Sabah. Again, I mentioned about some intertemporal elements coming into the picture. That might be stronger now. All I said was that matter of an independence for Sabah was discussed also even between Malaysia and the Philippines from the beginning. Now, the intertemporal part of it, I want to point out is that what was mentioned by Engineer Abe and Engineer Banlawi as promises of Malaysia that were not fulfilled, number one, those were not promises. Those were in the form of treaties. This, Engineer Abe, you know this, there were 13 conditions that Malaysia signed with the Malaysian government at the time before they would enter the federation. In fact, at around the time I left to Malaysia, one of the big issue was one of the conditionalities in that 13 conditions was that people from mainland Malaysia must get a visa from Sabah before they can enter. Of course, that was taken out and no longer observed. That's why that was one of the agitations by the Sabahans that that condition has been violated and is no longer there. Again, the second big violation was the matter of the resources.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Salamat po. Abe?
Dito papasok ang sinabi ni Ambassador, red herring. Sapagkat totoo yung sinabi ni Ambassador na one of the provisions included in the page 5 of the 1962 document na kung sakasakalis, more or less, sa Tagalog, kung sakasakali ang Pilipinas ay hindi niya already exhausted all peaceful means within the Pacific settlement of disputes, hindi nila makuha ang Sabah, ang binigay dokumento ay dapat ibalik sa Sultanate of Sulu. Dito ang kinatatakutan ng Sultanate of Sulu. That is why in 1989, tama yung sinabi ni Ambassador, Sultan Jamalul Kiram III withdrew that power of authority given to the Philippine government in 1962 due to the lukewarm attitude of the Philippine government towards the Sabah claim. Now, ito ang kinatatakutan ko gaya ng sinabi ni Professor Banlawi. If the resolution is conceived and founded doon sa economic development, yung sinabi doon sa document of 1962, pwede nang bawiin ng Sultanate of Sulu ang kanyang sovereign rights para magkaroon siya uli ng sovereign rights to assert claim over Sabah. Ito ang kinatatakutan natin. Kaya nga, nung nag-meeting tayo, Melo, sinabi ko, sumulat tayo ng aklat in order to protect the integrity and territorial boundary of the Sultanate of the Philippine government.
Yeah.
Kung sakasakali ito iiwasan, the Sultanate of Sulu never asserted sovereign claim over its ancestral territory in Sulu, Basilan, Tawi-Tawi, Zamboanga Peninsula, and Palawan. Ang nakakatakot dito, in relation doon sa sinabi ni Ambassador, what if magkaroon ng these areas would demand also that political advocacy similar to the political advocacy brought up by the inhabitants in Sabah. Thank you very much, Melo.
All right. One last question for the good Ambassador and Romel. Mula ito kay Michael Joe Delizo ng ABS-CBN. Ano nakikita niyong policy direction ni Joe Biden as regards to the South China Sea? And can you comment on the Chinese law allowing its Coast Guard to fire on foreign vessels when their sovereignty or jurisdiction is being infringed by foreign entities? Romel, ikaw kaya muna.
On the first question, we will benefit positively from Biden administration because of the foreign policy priority of Biden to respect international law, and the position of Biden when it comes to our victory in international arbitral case is very strong. So he will support us on that aspect. Secondly, Biden is committed to really account China for its actions in the South China Sea, and former State Secretary Hillary Clinton, Biden will strengthen its commitment to take actions in the area in order to prevent any major powers to dominate the area. And thirdly, there is also a strong commitment on the part of the Biden administration to strengthen its alliances in Asia, and the Philippines will benefit from that. Unlike before during the time of Trump, where Trump said that if the Philippines want to terminate the alliance, so be it. It will save the United States a lot of money. But Biden does not have that kind of perspective. Biden wants a reinvigoration, strengthening, and even widening of the alliance of U.S. in Asia, and part of that will be the Philippines. Now, on the part of China's passing of law authorizing its Coast Guard to use force to protect its sovereignty, it's a sovereign prerogative of any country to pass that kind of law. In fact, we already predated China for that. We authorized our China's Coast Guard to also use military force to protect our territories. Remember, our Philippine Coast Guard fired against Filipino fishermen in the Balintan Tunnel in order to protect our waters there. But of course, there is a norm in international law regarding prohibition of the use of excessive force. So
Okay.
if China will use excessive force in the area, then we have the right to also file a legal case, like what the Taiwan fishermen did to us, and we were accounted for that. So what is very important that when it comes to the use of force, especially by paramilitary forces like Coast Guard, there should be what we call the exercise of self-restraint on the use of force. Secondly, if there is the necessity to use force, it will only be used as a last resort. And thirdly, it will be for defensive purposes.
Okay. Mr. Ambassador?
Thank you. Well, firstly, on the matter of the Coast Guard, the Coast Guard has always been seen as a civilian agency. In the United States, it began as a oh my God, as a as a revenue service. Then later it was transferred to the Department of Commerce. It was always treated as a civilian agency. But after 911, it was incorporated in, I think it is the ninth or whatever, seventh uniformed service in the United States Armed Forces. Uh, in peacetime, the Coast Guard of the United States will be under the Department of not security, the new
Homeland
office,
Security.
Homeland Security. Right now, it is under the Homeland Security Department, but in wartime, the command will be transferred to the military.
Defense.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Then,
Now,
yeah, but I want to finish all the way to the Chinese Coast Guard. And worse, you look at the Posse Comitatus Act of the United States, it authorizes the Coast Guard to go abroad in military, but uh, the U.S. Coast Guard has had two interventions in our region in the past. One in the Java Sea, another one in the coast of Vietnam during the Vietnam War, and that was even before the quarrel on the South China Sea. So, using the Coast Guard in that in whatever way, the number one culprit is the United States of America, and they have that Posse Comitatus Act in place. Check out the website of the Department of their equivalent of the Department of State. It is there, the Posse Comitatus Act, and how the Coast Guard has been engaged under that act abroad, you know. And on the matter, and besides, the order of China, from what I read it in the papers, I have no inside story there. But reading the newspapers, the Chinese instruction is only to fire when necessary. So
Okay.
I really don't see any problem there. Our own Coast Guard should have that instructions also. Anyway, yeah, the other thing about the attitude of the new U.S. government, I have always said cannot be any change of policy on the part of the United States, whatever the administration, because the United States is not looking at the Philippines as a as important only in the quarrel over the South China Sea. It is important in its last bastion of spreading hegemony to the Asia Pacific. I mean, so this is what I say. Whether Trump or Biden, it is the strategic value of the Philippines that will dictate U.S. policy, and that cannot change. It's not about the South China Sea, the rule of law, or in fact the Mutual Defense Treaty of the Philippines. We have already learned our lesson on that aspect of the steadfastness of the United States under the Mutual Defense Treaty. When the United States left Clark and Subic, they suspended all military assistance, although in fact the Mutual Defense Treaty was still in force. They suspended all military assistance just like that for 10 years, resumed only after the terrorist attack in New York. And then all of a sudden, the defense treaty became suddenly mutual again in favor of the U.S. Thank you, Melo. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Maganda itong discussion. Romel, yung perception na yung America under a Democrat would value human rights. How will that position Mr. Biden with President Rodrigo Duterte, who is perceived to be violating human rights?
For me, Melo, when it comes to that issue, Biden will be cautious in dealing with the Philippines, especially under the leadership of President Duterte, because of the experiences that Duterte also knows how to retaliate. You know, like for example, until now, the Visiting Forces Agreement is still terminated, but the it just suspended the termination of the BFA. So Biden will still be strong on human rights issue, but when it comes to the Philippines, it will be very cautious. Maybe Biden will be strong in raising human rights issues in Hong Kong and in Uyghur and in Tibet. But when it comes to the Philippines, I think Biden will implement a more cautious approach.
Yeah. Mr. Ambassador, your thoughts, please? Paki-unmute lang po. Teka, sandali lang po. All right. Yes, please. Oops. Yes. Uy. Nagkasabay ulit. Nagkasabay. Sandali po. Nagkasabay. Please unmute. One more time. One. All right. Teka.
Muted.
Yan. Okay. Okay na po.
Thank
Yes.
you. Well, on human rights, let's put it this way. When you talk about ideologies, it used to be capitalist, communist, but now in defining ideologies, the United States has included human rights as an ideology. And that's why the U.S. insists that wherever in the world they have to enforce, support human rights. I mean, look, ang my difficulty there, it has become one way. They look at human rights violations all over the world, but they do not look inside at themselves. Why is it a big issue? Why is the United States in such a very big trouble now? It's because of racial issues, and isn't
Okay.
racial issue human rights? And then they hit at the Uyghur issue in Xinjiang in China and Nepal and wherever. But what about, can we look into the and research on the Navajo Nation in the United States? What happened to the ethnic Indians?
Yes.
They have, so this is my point. I mean, human rights, yes, they will still, whatever is the administration in the United States, they will have to espouse human rights because that is by law. That is part of their ideology.
Okay.
My problem in the Philippines is it will be as America's. They say that Trump is always transactional. No, for heaven's sake, America has always been. Let's look at our independence agreement with the United States. Isn't that transactional? So
Yeah.
I stop there. Okay,
Okay.
thank you.
All right. Mga kaibigan, this is a problem I have to face. Coming up with a forum as serious as this with Dr. Romel Banlawi, a political scientist and security analyst and director of the Center for Intelligence and National Security Studies, the Honorable Alberto Encomienda, a retired career foreign service officer, expert on the law of the sea, and former ambassador to Malaysia, Singapore, and Greece, and engineer Abet Ijirani of the Sultanate of Sulu. My problem is, anong topic na naman ang pag-uusapan sa susunod na Miyerkules, sa Wednesday Roundtable at Lido? I'd like to thank everyone who took time out to be with us today from all sides of the media at yung mga observers natin. Thank you very much. I hope we can also return on Facebook. There's nothing abusive in our discussions. Thank you. God bless us all. Till next time. Please stay safe. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Melo. Thank you, Ambassador.